Howdy folks, let's talk about a chart today. Talking about the chart of Aleister Crowley, the beast himself, 666, the infamous occultist, supposedly, really a black magician and a demonologist, the poster boy of evil for the Christian or the religious zealot, but not unreasonably so. He is a very interesting chart to look at esoterically because he was very much someone upon the Mutable Cross. There is no doubt about that, you guys. People tend to glamorize Crowley still, and it always baffles me because we really see a tragic life with this guy. Really a debaucherous kind of obvious polarizing into astral desire and its density, coming from a really rigid and pathologically anti-pleasure kind of Protestant sect with his parents. And of course, like we see with a lot of egomaniac men, a difficult imprint of the identity from the mother, and the mother gave him the name of the beast and thought her child was the Antichrist. And so really someone who reacted extremely blindly from these pathological early childhood circumstances, was very entitled, of course, had an inheritance from his parents, from his father, that he just lived off. And he ended up very sick and addicted to drugs and substances. People that he touched along the way had often committed suicide or were mentally ill. I mean, it's really a tragic story, and he ended his life, he did have a son towards the end of his life, and I think that was the first time he ever felt any kind of genuine, real love, and it was enough of a little flicker of something bearing a real spiritual power that he ever actually touched, and it caused him to question whether his life's work, his obsessive, compulsive drive into all of this bizarre, very Atlantean style solar plexusy sex magic. And he did have Uranus in the first house. So the 7th ray glamour there. Was it really all for nothing? Yeah, so people can make different arguments about whether it was all for nothing. I would say his best attribute really was his artistry. And had he been a more balanced personality and an integrated personality, he may have maybe not at a Da Vinci level, but certainly been a bit more of an emphasis on his artwork, divinely expressing a bunch of different ideas. So yes, he was someone on the Mutable Cross, but we can say he was an advanced personality, bearing in mind that someone like Hitler, who of course committed a great level of evil, was also an advanced personality insofar as there is clearly a response to certain ray forces and certain of the esoteric, let's say, vibrational energies of some of the planets. And this is one of the challenges when we understand this greater esoteric psychology, is that yes, people can commit these great acts of inversion and evil and separatist acts that can cause a lot of karma and violence, but they are responding to, nonetheless, these greater forces. So there's a certain degree of experience that the soul has to gain before that can happen in the first place. I haven't got my laptop with me here today, so I'm just going to put the image up on the screen. You let me know if it's annoying or not very effective. I'm going to eventually get to a point where I can edit these things a little bit more professionally, but we're just sort of scraping by for now, just so we can get some things out there. So this, being an occultist, very much a Leo thing, and he was a Leo rising with Uranus in Leo. Now this is where we see this great urge to freedom. The big thing with Aleister Crowley, for those of you who don't know his work, his whole big thing, he wanted to have a religion. This is a classic Leonian megalomania, and these type of narcissistic personality types, Leonian narcissistic types, often get that projection of all of that power when people project the self archetype onto them. So attracting a kind of diffused Aquarian group thinking person who's not individualized enough to really access or recognize their own power. And so there's a certain projection of that with this magnetic over the top personality type. So very quintessential in that sense. His main law was do what thou wilt. The problem with this is he made no distinction about what was moving one's desire or will. And in his case, as we kind of touched on in the beginning, so much of what he wanted to do and how he wanted to express was really just a reaction to his early childhood pathology. And so then he just kind of swinging the other way, and then calling it hidden mystical science, which it isn't really, because a real deep scientific penetration into the mysterious and into the hidden would have taken him into a more subjective awareness, or rather an objective awareness of his subjective inner landscape. And he never did any of that. He didn't penetrate himself enough deeply to really ask who I am. He went, I just want to be free and do whatever I want. And that is the God principle that we see in Leo. And that is what's tricky about this Uranus in the first house in Leo, is that we know that Uranus is the co-ruler of the sign Leo with the sun at the hierarchical level of Leo. So that is to say that the spirit is ultimately free, right, at the highest possible level. Seventh ray, magic ray, spirit to matter, bam. So we can see that the imprint of that is or that the core essence of that is streaming through Crowley and what he spoke of. But again, it's being filtered down through the lower self and the personality. So urge towards freedom, but like a lot of people who have this immature Uranian quality to them, this exoteric Uranian quality, they want to bypass Saturn processes, Saturnian processes of maturation. And you can't do it, ever. So he wanted to break out of every religious restriction. But his desire to, and this is where Buddhism might have been helpful for him if he had taken that a bit more seriously, he was obviously driven by this reactionism again. He wanted to be free of this religious restriction, but in trying to break out of it and reacting from it, he of course remained a slave to it. And he remained a slave in the other way, where he became a slave to his desire. And you look at his poetry and things, and he wrote some really wild stuff. I mean, talking about piss and shit, and he did his black magic, the sex magic, the shadow glamour of the seventh ray, and so part of the Uranian problem is in this, the glamour of sex magic. It's Atlantean. This is the kind of stuff they were doing, doing all these rituals with blood and semen, and then even bestiality. I mean, he really was like, just wanted to go to the extreme. But of course, never really developed any true spiritual virtue. And again, he ended up burning through his inheritance and ended up with nothing and riddled with diseases and heroin addicted and all of this, right? And a lot of people, again, who came close to him committed suicide, and it was really a disaster. Now, part of this Saturnian problem that I just described with the immature Uranian quality, we can also see in his chart, given that Uranus is literally opposite Saturn. So this Saturn being the dweller on the threshold for him, being in the seventh house of the dweller on the threshold, of the shadow, of the other. So him kind of projecting out his own limited restrictions and then trying to usurp that through an immature Uranian lens. Okay, I'm just going to do whatever I want. That is the whole of the law. It's ridiculous. And that's part of his negative father problem too, because, his father was this pastor. Is pastor? Minister? It was a Protestant sect. Right, and I thought it was so interesting, his father died of a kind of tongue cancer, I think. I just thought that's really interesting in terms of the distortion of expression as just an interesting manifestation. And even with the throat having a connection to the sacral center, so if they're pathologically anti-sacral, right? So he had a negative father complex, and we see these sorts of reactions to this kind of negative father problem in men and women, where they go into this this astral thing, this deeply reactive sexuality, or this immature urge for freedom, but there isn't really a unifying that with the principle of consciousness. And so as much as Aleister Crowley did talk about love, he wasn't someone who ever really experienced love, at least not until he got a little inkling of it through his son at the later part of his life, when he actually wanted something positive for someone. He really genuinely felt that at that point. He'd never felt that up until that point. He really did not give a fuck about anyone else. So Yeah, so okay, coming back to Uranus though, Uranus being this very much a Deva planet, all of these elemental forces come under the 7th ray, so it's very powerful. Of course, he was very magnetic. He has a Libra sun, which is esoterically ruled by Uranus, so then Libra has that magnetic quality to it as well, and then we see a little bit of that echo with Venus and its exoteric rulership, and then having Uranus in the first houses, this magnetism, this sacral potency would have really whacked people right in the face, and that's partly why people were drawn to him. They would really, that projection of that power principle. Of course, it made it really easy for him to play out the role of Leonian dictator. So rays 1 and 5 through Leo, again, that's why Leo can be the sign of the occultist. I really don't consider Crowley though to be a true occultist. I mean, it's partly a semantic issue, you can call him that if you want and make arguments for what language we use, but where I'm coming from is that the occult really being that which penetrates the inner veil, or penetrates through the veil into the real source of substance. He didn't do that though, because he didn't penetrate the heart of his own consciousness. So instead he was a black magician. He played around with astral magic. And he tried to use the substance. This is the materialism, which we can also see in Libra. And I've touched on this before, but sometimes the way Libra can express is very much like a Scorpio, because Libra is the weighing of the opposites, the weighing of the spiritual and material values. And in some cases, it leans towards materiality. And then you have this falling into the Maya. Of course, Maya being the word attributed to Scorpio in its the lower keynote for Scorpio is let Maya flourish and deception rule. So yeah, so that's the thing here with this Uranian piece. But certainly this preoccupation with sex, Libra being a sign of sex and the bringing together of the opposites. But what's interesting though, again, at being an advanced personality, is we see so many potential keys of divine revelation through Crowley and some of his ideas, and wanting to bring together the opposites, and wanting, in a very Uranian synthesis, 7th ray way, wanting to bring all the religions together and pulling from here and here and here and here and here. And he was a great artist. He was a brilliant painter. I think, again, that's what his true purpose would have been, not a demonologist, a cult, running his Thelema Crowleyanity religion. That was something he actually said, Crowleyanity being part of the future. I mean, megalomania much. That was all like part of his psychopathy. But his true gift really was in the artistry. And I think some of the things that have stood the test of time from his work, I think a lot of the books, I don't really find anything profound in what he wrote, really. It's just the shadow of it, the inconsistency of it, or rather the lack of spiritual virtue in it, truly, is just really, it just doesn't do anything for me. But things like the Thoth deck, I mean, it's still very creative. Leo is, of course, a creative sign. And when we have that creative urge, and he probably may have been a 4th ray personality type anyway, because of his orientation towards the arts and the interplay with the opposites as well, although we see that through Libra and through Uranus there. But I think that really would have been his higher purpose. And if he had not been so pathologically polarized, he may have just been more of an artist, or really that would have been where he expressed his divine messages, or all of this. But he was doing all kinds of crazy stuff. He was having sex in the pyramids before they blocked off. You can't do that these days, basically. And talking to demons. He was channeling. He definitely was a black magician, okay? He was channeling all kinds of, and relating with all kinds of astral deities, calling themselves this. One of the books he wrote was basically a dictation from an astral entity. And, these are evocation of the old gods, this lack of differentiation of what it actually is that you're bringing into being. It's a power drive. I want to have all this force and power, but I have making no distinction between what's coming through. Really, that lack of the higher turn of Libra, which would be to know the law of love. And he did not know the law of love. Again, he was trapped in his pathological narcissism, and his, very much being defined by his early circumstances. His Pisces moon bringing some of this psychic quality. We can see very sensitive people with this placement. It can be empathic, in his case not empathic, but certainly that intuitive quality that comes through the water signs that can lead to that kind of trance mediumship quality. well aspected with Pluto and Mars in his chart. I think the Pluto in Taurus is interesting. Of course, Pluto is one of these generational planets, but because he was an advanced personality, we can see more of the activations of the transpersonal planets in the chart. And so Pluto in Taurus, the sign of pleasure, right? And the drive towards pleasure and the pleasure principle. And I mean, was he a heathen? Yeah, in a way he was, but he had a logic to it. He felt like he was really trying to penetrate the hidden side of the form life. Now that's actually what I just described there is very Uranian. That's the exoteric aspect of Uranus and its connection to science, because that's what science is, right? It is penetrating deeper, deeper, deeper into the form life to understand the hidden mysteries of form. So there's still an intuitive quality there, but it's still within the realms of substance and matter. Venus is the fifth ray planet of concrete knowledge and science, which rules Taurus exoterically, right? So just this penetrative drive into substance and the Taurian problem of the power, Pluto, and the inversion or the deception. Remember, Pluto is co-ruler of Scorpio, sign of deception with Mars exoterically. This driving into the pleasure principle, and okay, I'm going to do this, and we're going to overcome every limitation by going deeper into desire and deeper into, all our potential limitations and da-da-da-da. But although this really is part of this Saturnian problem once again, because again, you're still reacting to a restriction rather than seeing what is the highest possible level of restriction, which would be Saturn in its higher quality in terms of bringing things together, of structuring things, and Saturn is the hierarchical ruler of Libra, the law of love. It's understanding how to incarnate the law of love. Again, something he didn't want to do. Anything that he felt was a restriction, he wanted to break open, and that's partly what drove his perversions into the bestiality and these sexual rituals. But guys, like this astral magic stuff, I mean, people were there with him and drinking blood. One dude, he drank some blood from somewhere and he got sick from, an unclean bowl and died. And it's just this very down to earth, practical reality, like, oh, I'm doing all this magic and the blood has all this power. This is Atlantean bullshit. It's astral bullshit. It's the lower expression of the seventh ray, this kind of pagan, lower aspect of pagan magic. It's not an anti-pagan statement, by the way, because everything has a place when we synthesize it with every other piece. But this lower aspect of the Deva kingdom, of the paganism, of that which is below the veil of consciousness, and we're kind of projecting all these psychic meanings onto things. Oh, the blood has all this magic to it, except that, you didn't clean the bowl properly and now a dude's dead. So did it really have all the power that you thought it had, or were you just projecting all this nonsense onto it and then bringing all this chaos from that? Yoy. There's a lot of interesting things in his chart. We talked about Libra and its echo to Scorpio when it leans towards materialism. He also had Jupiter and Mercury in Scorpio, right? So this activation, this ballooning up of the plutonic instinctual energies, those things which actually would need to be regenerated if you're working properly with consciousness to really redeem matter. And to say what matter needs to be redeemed isn't an anti-matter statement. It's just saying that it's referring to matter and substance as that which accumulates karma and eventually kind of gets all the swampy, nasty stuff from everything that conglomerates around and grows out of not being touched by loving consciousness. Uranus square Pluto natally also brings another dimension to the problem of that immature Uranian urge towards freedom, which ends up being a kind of adolescent fuck you, any restriction, all of that, which we spoke of with Uranus opposite Saturn. But with the Pluto there, it's also that power drive that we spoke of with Pluto in Taurus. And the destructive element of the attitude that this Uranian quality is taking on in Crowley's chart, at least. That would be the destructive use of sex magic to amplify that power principle, etc., etc. What's also interesting about Crowley too is that again, being an advanced man, responding to some of these rheological and more focused energetic influences of the transpersonal planets, for instance. Very much a little bit ahead of the times, really, because his work ended up being, he died at the end of the 40s, 1947, I believe. And his work ended up kind of being revamped by all of these, the new wave hippies and the rock and roll stars, the Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones as well, I think, the Beatles on the Sgt. Pepper album, like Crowleyism and hedonism and do what thou wilt and break out of the... So all of this was what Crowley was doing was a hint at some of the Uranian urge to come through in the collective. Still the lesser aspect of Uranus, because I've spoken about what the true Uranian urge is, which is to bring together all of those, let's say, the Devas forces and the material forces of being, to bring in a structural component. Right? Seventh ray it is a magic ray, but it's ceremonial order. So that's why it's a very practical ray, the seventh ray. And seventh ray people really get things done. It's bringing everything together. But the true magic isn't through doing all the Atlantean rituals. It's just by virtue of one's consciousness and the capacity to will consciously. If we're needing to do all these witchcrafty rituals, this is, again, it's just childish. It's just, not that you couldn't have a ritual it's imbued with meaning. And I always think of the Cancerian ritualism, like, just how I brush my hair in the morning. Anything can be a ritual, but when it's all this glamour, I'm gonna stir the pot and put the blood in the eye of the newt, and where we get that almost exoteric or mad kind of magic, the image of the witch and the wizard, versus really seeing what that is with consciousness, which is really just directed intention, imbued with loving consciousness, imbued with the will. Seventh ray has that first ray component, of course. So he was ahead of the time in that way. He was responding to this incoming Aquarian age, but insofar as we also see the lesser aspect where we had the downsides of the hippie movement. Yeah, it's okay, the idealism of free love and breaking out of Saturnian restriction, but the only way you can really break out of restriction is to work with the Saturnian principle of limitation consciously, where it's actually the process of maturation. So as I've touched on this elsewhere several times, where I talk about the neo-paganism or the hippie movement being this immature Uranian quality that so often is a psychological reflection of the negative father problem, where it becomes a kind of sleazy, just undifferentiated glob of instinctual movements, which would be the lesser aspect of the sacral center or the solar plexus center, versus really working with those energies, which requires the use of consciousness, the use of restriction and responsibility, and most importantly, as a Libran piece, the application of the law of love, the contemplation and the reflection on what am I really? See, that would have been the higher octave of Crowley's life if he had really been responding to his soul, which he was not. He was not obedient to his soul. And he had some beautiful things to say about the integrity of the individual, and in a way that was a little bit like what we touched on with Buckminster Fuller and with his Libra placements being in the third house, of owning one's process. It's actually a good third house example because he spoke about that. Do what thou wilt. Everyone has a process by which they can individuate and become themselves, and one should follow that. That's great in theory, but again, to really live that, it would require the love principle to be the foundation so that you really know who you are. That would be the deeper side of Leo. Esoteric sun ruling Leo, sun veiling Neptune, the Christ. I am the universal love. I am not the form of my reactive identity of just the personality type as it's making impacts without me questioning what that is. He didn't penetrate himself enough deeply. He followed his libido blindly into these pathological polarities. That's what he did. He did not really know himself at his heart, because to know oneself is to know the soul and to become obedient to that. So what Crowley says about do what thou wilt works as a spiritual law if you're under the law of occult discipleship, if you are an occult disciple. He was not in surrender to his God self though. He would have had to get to that point, he would have had to come against his negative father problem and resolve the conflict between his pathological experience of Christianity versus the real mystical transmission of the divine love principle that is actually at the basis of the Christian religion, or at the core of the Christ as a figure and as a representative of the soul. So it's one of those things where there are some good things and some cool archetypal imprints that you can see through Crowley's work, where you go, oh yeah, there's definitely, you know, he's transmitting a higher archetype here. But he was such a fragmented person. He was such a megalomaniac, psychopathic personality that, you know, those things that he was starting to respond to were expressing through this fragmentation. So not a synthesized person. But again, a very interesting chart to look at esoterically, because we can again see some of these impulses of the ray forces of the transpersonal planets acting in a more individualistic way, and seeing those the very dramatic consequences of what can happen when you do start responding to those energies, but you still haven't fully gotten a handle on the interplay of the relationship between the higher and lower selves, in which case, as we see with Crowley, just the blasting out, all of this esoteric force, but it's blasting out through this very unstable and really a weak personality. You think of the Black Magician, the modern example would be the Voldemort character, who had all this power, right? And he brought all these people to him. Everyone who was chasing the power, those were all of his followers. I mean, a lot of people are like that. And they will go to that person because they have the ability to manipulate and do all these powerful things. But as we see in the Harry Potter series, what happens is when Harry dies and he goes into that libido, the liminal purgatory space where he talks to Dumbledore, and they have that image of that part of Voldemort, which is really his true essence. That was the soul part of himself, but it's this little fetal, disgusting looking golem-y type figure. And you see that's actually what his real essence is, because he continued to follow power and to fragment himself. That's what the Horcruxes are in the Harry Potter series. So you have to conceal your soul away, and you can only do that through murder, to like a real separatist act. I mean, it's a great metaphor that J.K. Rowling brought through, because we know that evil, at the root of evil, is an attitude of separation. The heresy of separateness, as it's so called in the works. And we also see that with the guy who did the freezing the water, and you look at the microscopic level, and when you put the words on and you put evil, and what's evil, it's like one little dot and it's separated from the rest. So we see that there can be the glamour of the magician, third and seventh ray glamour, right? But what is the spiritual virtue at the core? Because that's most important. And yes, if you get someone who's got, you're talking about a seventh ray master now, like I'm blanking on his name right now, what his last supposed incarnation was. One of his incarnations was said to be Shakespeare. Okay, interplay of the opposites there. Oh God, it's pissing me off that I can't remember his name right now. I'm going to put it up on the screen. There you go, I did it. That's someone who could make magic happen as a result of the development of spiritual virtue. So yes, we still have the capacity for magic and the ritualistic aspect and these very powerful energies that come through the sacral center. We can still have that. It's not that that's a problem in and of itself, but what matters most is the spiritual center from which one is operating. Obviously, always while I talk about, the heart becomes the most important thing first, orienting towards the love principle, really growing stronger in what the true self is. And that is the deeper essence of Leo, Sun and Neptune, Sun veiling Neptune at the esoteric level. I am the universal love principle. So really, at the end of the day, Aleister Crowley is a cautionary tale for any immature, pathologically polarized person who's got daddy issues and mummy issues and is wanting to chase very indiscriminately astral magic. I mean, we could definitely say something like Crowley was a reincarnated person probably from the moon chain, and probably going way back into Atlantean days and really just reliving the glory days, trying to at least. But really a tragic figure. Of course, we can admire some of his artistic works. There's some really cool work there. And some of the principles, again, that he brought through really do evoke a certain archetypal truth about these different forces that he was working with and responding to. But he was definitely not someone who really lived those out in a way that was true. He was very much veiled in the Maya. So I hope you enjoyed this and found it interesting. Let me know what you think. Share with me your thoughts, reflections, considerations. Okay guys, I'll see you soon.